It was a chilly autumn evening in the small town of Ridgefield, where life usually moved at a slow and predictable pace. Officer Mark Thompson had been on duty for nearly 12 hours, but he decided to take one last patrol around the outskirts of town before calling it a night. The roads here were quiet, flanked by towering trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Shadows stretched across the asphalt as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Mark drove his police cruiser slowly, scanning the area with sharp eyes honed by years of experience. As he rounded a bend on an isolated stretch of highway, something unusual caught his attention: a black hearse speeding down the road ahead of him. It wasn't just the speed that struck him as odd. It was the way the vehicle seemed to weave slightly, almost as if its driver was trying to avoid being noticed. In all his years as a cop, Mark had never seen a hearse traveling so recklessly, especially not this late at night. Something about it felt off. Mark's instincts kicked into gear. He flicked on the siren and signaled for the hearse to pull over. Reluctantly, the vehicle slowed down and came to a stop on the shoulder of the road. Mark stepped out of his cruiser, gripping his flashlight tightly. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the driver's side window. The tension in the air was palpable, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Shining. His flashlight inside, Mark saw a man sitting behind the wheel. The driver looked nervous. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his knuckles were white. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool temperature. "License and registration," Mark said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man fumbled awkwardly, opening the glove compartment and pulling out the requested documents. But Mark's gaze kept drifting toward the back of the hearse. There was something unsettling about the coffin resting silently there, shrouded in darkness. "Is everything okay?" Mark asked, trying to gauge the driver's demeanor. The man nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact. Yeah, everything's fine," he muttered, his voice shaky. Mark frowned. Everything didn't seem fine, not at all. Most people driving a hearse would be somber, perhaps even grieving, but this man looked like he was hiding something. And then, without fully understanding why, Mark made a decision that would change everything. "Open the casket," he ordered suddenly, surprising even himself. The command hung in the air like a storm cloud. The driver froze, his face turning pale under the harsh glare of the flashlight. "What? Why? You can't do that," he stammered, panic rising in his voice. But Mark stood his ground, his expression unwavering. He had learned long ago to trust his gut, and right now his instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong. After a moment of hesitation, the driver reluctantly stepped out of the hearse, fumbling with keys until he unlocked the rear door. Together, they opened the coffin, and what Mark saw inside left him speechless. Instead of a body or any sign of mourning, the coffin was filled with stacks of neatly bundled cash. Each package was wrapped in plastic, gleaming under the dim light of the flashlight. For a split second, Mark forgot how to breathe. This wasn't grief, it was greed. The driver began to babble nervously, trying to explain. "I swear I didn't know what was in there. Some guy hired me to drive this thing. I thought it was just, normal stuff." But Mark wasn't buying it. He placed the man under arrest immediately, confiscating the money as evidence while calling for backup. As he stood there, staring at the coffin full of cash, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple traffic violation. Who would go through such elaborate lengths to transport illegal funds using a hearse? And why? Back at the station, the investigation began to unfold. Officers examined the bundles of cash, tracing their serial numbers and discovering ties to a notorious crime syndicate involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. It appeared the criminals had devised a clever plan to move their illicit earnings under the radar, using hearses as mobile safes. No one would suspect a funeral procession of carrying anything other than sorrow. Mark realized he had uncovered only the tip of the iceberg. Over the next few days, the case consumed him. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together clues that led them closer to identifying the mastermind behind the operation. Surveillance footage revealed connections between the arrested driver and several key members of the syndicate. Wiretaps uncovered cryptic conversations hinting at upcoming transactions. The police were closing in, but tensions ran high. Everyone knew they were dealing with dangerous individuals who wouldn't hesitate to protect their secrets. Despite warnings from his superiors, Mark threw himself into the investigation. He couldn't let go of the image of that coffin filled with cash. It haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Was this just a random encounter, or had fate intervened to put him in the right place at the right time? He often replayed the events of that night in his head, wondering if things might have turned out differently had he chosen to ignore his gut instinct. Then came the breakthrough. One of the detectives identified a warehouse listed in the wiretap recordings. A raid was planned, and Mark insisted on joining the team, despite protest from his colleagues. They argued that he was too valuable to the case, but Mark refused to back down. He felt personally invested in bringing these criminals to justice. Little did he know the raid would test his courage in ways he could never have anticipated. Under cover of darkness, the SWAT team moved swiftly toward the warehouse. Inside, they found stacks of cash similar to those discovered in the Hearse, along with weapons and drugs worth millions. Just as they secured the area, shots rang out from a hidden corner. Chaos erupted as officers scrambled for cover. Mark spotted movement near a stack of crates and gave chase, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He followed the shadowy figure into a narrow corridor, heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, the figure turned, revealing none other than the man believed to be the head of the syndicate. Cornered and desperate, the criminal lunged at Mark, knocking him off balance. A fierce struggle ensued, both men grappling for control. Mark managed to subdue the suspect just as reinforcements arrived, dragging the man away in handcuffs. Exhausted, but victorious, Mark leaned against the wall, catching his breath. The weight of what he'd accomplished hit him all at once. In the weeks that followed, news outlets buzzed with stories of the takedown. The public hailed Mark as a hero, crediting him with exposing a massive criminal network. Awards and commendations poured in, but Mark remained humble. He often reflected on that fateful night when he pulled over the speeding Hearse, wondering if things might have turned out differently had he chosen to ignore his gut instinct. Life eventually returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for someone who had stared danger in the face and emerged victorious. Mark continued his work as a dedicated officer, always vigilant, always ready to serve and protect. Yet deep down, he knew he'd never forget the shock of opening that coffin and finding cold, hard cash instead of a lifeless body. Years later, during retirement speeches and interviews, Mark would recount the story with a wry smile, reminding everyone that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. It was a tale of courage, perseverance, and a little bit of luck, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the world, justice could prevail. After the initial shock of discovering the coffin filled with cash, Officer Mark Thompson quickly regained his composure. He knew he was dealing with something far more serious than a routine traffic stop. The driver, now visibly sweating and trembling, tried to explain himself again. "Look, I didn't know what was inside. Some guy paid me good money just to drive this thing from point A to point B. That's all I did. I swear." Mark listened carefully, but remained skeptical. It wasn't uncommon for low-level criminals to claim ignorance when caught red-handed, especially if they were working under orders. Still, the man's nervous demeanor and lack of resistance suggested there might be some truth to his story. For now, though, explanations could wait. This was a crime scene, and Mark had a job to do. He secured the area, ensuring that no evidence would be tampered with before backup arrived. As he waited, his mind raced with questions. Who would think of using a hearse, a symbol of death, and mourning as a disguise for transporting illegal funds? It was both ingenious and disturbing. Mark couldn't help but feel uneasy about the implications. If this was part of a larger operation, then Ridgefield wasn't as safe as everyone thought it was. When reinforcements finally arrived, the scene became a flurry of activity. Officers cordoned off the area, while detectives began questioning the arrested driver in greater detail. Meanwhile, the bundles of cash were carefully loaded into evidence bags and sent to the station for further analysis. Mark accompanied the team back to headquarters, eager to learn more about the mysterious syndicate behind this scheme. At the precinct, the investigation intensified. Forensic experts examined the serial numbers on the bills, tracing their origins, and uncovering connections to a notorious crime ring operating across multiple states. These weren't just random stacks of money. They were proceeds from drug trafficking, extortion, and other illicit activities. The sheer scale of the operation shocked even seasoned investigators. Detective Sarah Collins, who specialized in organized crime, took charge of the case. She briefed Mark and the rest of the team on what they had uncovered so far. "This isn't your average street gang," she explained, her voice calm but firm. "We're dealing with a highly sophisticated network. They've been laundering millions through shell companies, real estate, and offshore accounts. Using hearses is just one piece of the puzzle." As the days turned into weeks, the investigation grew increasingly complex. Surveillance footage revealed links between the arrested driver and several high-profile figures within the syndicate. Wiretaps captured cryptic conversations hinting at upcoming transactions and drop-off points. Every lead seemed to point toward a major breakthrough, but also carried significant risks. The closer they got to unraveling the web, the more dangerous things became. Mark found himself consumed by the case. Even during his off hours, he couldn't stop thinking about the hearse, the cash, and the people pulling the strings. He replayed the events of that night over and over in his head, searching for clues he might have missed. Was there something else hidden in plain sight? Had he overlooked a critical detail that could bring down the entire operation? One evening, after hours of poring over documents and listening to wiretap recordings, Detective Collins approached Mark with an update. Her expression was grim but determined. "We've identified a potential warehouse," she said. "It's listed in several intercepted communications. If we're right, it could be holding millions in cash, drugs, and weapons." The news sent a jolt of adrenaline through Mark. Finally, they had a concrete target, a chance to strike back against the criminals responsible for flooding their town with violence and corruption. But Collins warned him not to get too excited. "This won't be easy," she cautioned. "These guys are smart and they're dangerous. We need to plan every move carefully." Despite her warnings, Mark volunteered to join the raid team. His superiors initially resisted, arguing that he was too valuable to risk in such a volatile situation. After all, Mark had already played a pivotal role in exposing the syndicate. Losing him now could jeopardize the entire operation. But Mark refused to back down. He felt personally invested in seeing justice served, not just for himself but for the community he had sworn to protect. Preparations for the raid began immediately. SWAT teams assembled, reviewing blueprints of the warehouse and strategizing entry points. Intelligence reports indicated that the facility was heavily guarded, with armed men patrolling both inside and outside. Any mistake could result in disaster. Tensions ran high as officers prepared mentally and physically for what lay ahead. On the night of the raid, the air was thick with anticipation. Under cover of darkness, the team moved silently toward the warehouse, their flashlights off to avoid detection. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the group, gripping his weapon tightly. Years of training had prepared him for moments like this, yet nothing could fully replicate the intensity of stepping into unknown danger. As they breached the building, chaos erupted almost instantly. Alarms blared, and shouts echoed through the cavernous space. Inside, they found rows upon rows of neatly stacked cash, crates of illegal drugs, and shelves lined with firearms. It was clear they had hit the jackpot, the nerve center of the Sind everyone involved. Mark's instincts kicked in immediately. He focused on securing the area, ensuring that no suspects escaped while evidence was gathered. Suddenly, movement caught his eye near a stack of crates. A shadowy figure darted past, disappearing into a narrow corridor. Without hesitation, Mark gave chase, his footsteps echoing against the cold concrete floor. Adrenaline surged through him as he rounded a corner, spotting the fleeing individual. Up ahead. "Stop," Mark shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. But the figure kept running, desperate to evade capture. Mark pushed forward, closing the gap inch by inch. When he finally reached the suspect, the man turned abruptly, revealing none other than the suspected leader of the syndicate. Cornered and out of options, the criminal lunged at Mark, knocking him off balance. A fierce struggle ensued, both men grappling for control amidst the cluttered hallway. Mark fought with everything he had, fueled by determination and a sense of duty. Despite the odds, he managed to subdue the suspect, pinning him to the ground until backup arrived. Reinforcements flooded the corridor, dragging the man away in handcuffs. Exhaustion washed over Mark as he leaned against the wall, catching his breath. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of relief. They had done it. They had struck a devastating blow to the syndicate. In the aftermath of the raid, news outlets buzzed with stories of the takedown. The public hailed Mark and his fellow officers as heroes, crediting them with dismantling a massive criminal network. Awards and commendations poured in, but Mark remained humble. He often reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the fateful night he pulled over the speeding hearse to the intense raid that exposed the truth. Life eventually returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for someone who had stared danger in the face and emerged victorious. Mark continued his work as a dedicated officer, always vigilant, always ready to serve and protect. Yet deep down, he knew he'd never forget the shock of opening that coffin and finding cold, hard cash instead of a lifeless body. Years later, during retirement speeches and interviews, Mark would recount the story with a wry smile, reminding everyone that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. It was a tale of courage, perseverance, and a little bit of luck, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the world, justice could prevail. The aftermath of the raid left Ridgefield buzzing with a mix of shock and relief. For years, whispers about organized crime had lingered in the shadows, but no one had dared to confront the truth head-on. Now, thanks to Officer Mark Thompson and his team, the town finally had answers and justice. The warehouse bust had uncovered not only millions in cash but also enough drugs and weapons to cripple the syndicate's operations for good. It was a monumental victory, one that would be talked about for generations. At the precinct, the atmosphere was electric. Officers patted each other on the back, their faces glowing with pride. Detectives sifted through evidence, piecing together the final details of the case. Every document, every intercepted phone call, and every clue pointed to a sprawling network of corruption that extended far beyond Ridgefield. The syndicate's tentacles reached into neighboring towns, cities, and even across state lines. But, for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Mark sat at his desk late into the night, staring at the pile of paperwork in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote up his report, the events of the past few weeks replaying in his mind like a movie. The speeding hearse, the coffin filled with cash, the desperate chase through the warehouse. It all felt surreal, like something out of a crime novel. Yet here he was, living it. Despite the accolades and praise pouring in from every direction, Mark couldn't shake the weight of what he'd witnessed. He thought about the driver who claimed ignorance, the armed guards at the warehouse, and the leader of the syndicate who had fought tooth and nail to escape. These weren't just criminals. They were people driven by greed, desperation, or fear. And while Mark didn't sympathize with their actions, he couldn't help but wonder how they had ended up on such a dark path. Detective Sarah Collins joined him in the office, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on Mark's desk and took a seat across from him. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," she said gently. Her tone was kind, almost motherly, which made Mark relax a little. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I keep thinking about how close we came to missing this," he admitted. "If I hadn't stopped that hearse, if I hadn't trusted my gut, hell, if I hadn't ordered them to open the coffin." He shook his head, trailing off. "It's scary to think about how easily they could have gotten away with it." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's why we do what we do," she replied. "We can't control everything, Mark. All we can do is show up, stay sharp, and hope we make the right calls when it matters most. You did that, and more." Her words brought some comfort, but Mark still wrestled with lingering doubts. What if there were others like the hearse driver, People coerced into doing terrible things because they had no choice. What if the syndicate regrouped elsewhere, continuing their operations under different names and methods? The idea unsettled him. No matter how many arrests they made or how much evidence they collected, the fight against crime never truly ended. Over the next few days, the investigation expanded further. Forensic analysts traced the origins of the drugs seized during the raid, linking them to international cartels. Financial experts unraveled the intricate web of money laundering schemes, exposing shell companies and fake identities used to mask illegal transactions. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of the syndicate's reach and influence. Meanwhile, media coverage reached fever pitch. Reporters camped outside the precinct, eager for updates on the case. Local news channels aired special segments, highlighting Mark's role in uncovering the operation. Strangers approached him at grocery stores and gas stations, thanking him for his bravery. At first, Mark found the attention overwhelming, but he soon realized it wasn't just about him. It was about restoring faith in law enforcement and proving that justice could prevail, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Still, Mark struggled to adjust to life after the raid. Sleep eluded him most nights, his dreams haunted by images of the warehouse and the coffin. During the day, he often found himself zoning out, lost in thought. His colleagues noticed the change and encouraged him to take time off, but Mark refused. Staying busy kept his mind occupied, and besides, he felt a responsibility to see the case through to the end. One afternoon, as Mark reviewed surveillance footage from the warehouse, something caught his eye. A fleeting glimpse of a figure standing near the entrance, a woman dressed in black, partially obscured by shadows. She hadn't been part of the initial sweep, and none of the reports mentioned her presence. Mark rewound the tape, studying her movements closely. Something about her demeanor struck him as odd. She seemed too calm, too deliberate, given the chaos unfolding around her. He flagged the clip for Detective Collins, who agreed it warranted further investigation. Could she be another key player? Mark asked, pointing to the screen. Maybe someone higher up in the chain? It's possible, Sarah replied. Or maybe she's just a bystander caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, we need to find out. Tracking down the mysterious woman proved challenging. She appeared only briefly in the footage, and without clear facial recognition, identifying her became a game of trial and error. Days turned into weeks as the team combed through databases, cross-referencing known associates of the syndicate with potential matches. Just when it seemed like they'd hit a dead end, a breakthrough emerged. A tip came in from an anonymous source. A name and address scribbled hastily on a scrap of paper slipped under the precinct's door. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, suggesting urgency. Mark recognized the name immediately. It belonged to someone high on their list of persons of interest. Could this be the woman from the video? Armed with the new lead, Mark and his team prepared for another operation. This time, however, they exercised extreme caution. The stakes were higher than ever. If the woman truly was connected to the syndicate, capturing her could provide the final piece of the puzzle, or provoke retaliation from whoever remained loyal to the organization. On the morning of the planned arrest, Mark stood outside the suspect's apartment building, his heart pounding. Rain drizzled steadily, soaking his jacket and chilling him to the bone. He glanced at his watch, then at the team gathered around him. Everyone was ready. Taking a deep breath, he gave the signal to move in. What happened next would test Mark's resolve in ways he couldn't have imagined. As they entered the building, they encountered resistance, not from the woman herself, but from someone protecting her. Shots rang out, echoing through the narrow hallway. Chaos erupted once again, forcing Mark to rely on every ounce of training, an instinct he possessed. In that moment, he understood that the battle against crime was far from over. 正义不仅需要勇气，还需要不懈的努力和牺牲. The operation to arrest the mysterious woman began with a sense of foreboding that hung heavy in the air. Officer Mark Thompson stood outside the apartment building, rain dripping steadily from his hat and soaking into his uniform. Despite the weather, he felt a strange dryness in his throat, a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The team around him was equally tense, their faces grim as they reviewed the plan one last time. They knew this wasn't just another routine raid. If the woman was indeed connected to the syndicate, capturing her could unravel the remaining threads of the criminal network or provoke a violent backlash. Mark gave the signal, and the team moved swiftly toward the entrance. Inside, the dimly lit hallway smelled of damp carpet and old wood. The walls were cracked and peeling, evidence of neglect, but the building's shabby exterior masked the danger lurking within. As they approached the suspect's door, Mark's pulse quickened. Every step seemed louder than it should be, every creak of the floorboards an alarm waiting to sound. When they reached the apartment, 2 officers positioned themselves on either side of the door while another prepared to breach it. On Mark's command, the battering ram slammed into the lock, splintering the wood and sending the door swinging open. The team rushed inside, guns drawn, shouting for anyone inside to identify themselves. At first, the apartment appeared empty. Furniture was sparse, a couch, a table, and a few chairs, but there was no sign of life. Then suddenly, shots rang out from a back room. Bullets whizzed past Mark's head, embedding themselves in the wall behind him. Instinctively, he dove for cover, his heart pounding like a drum. His team returned fire, the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing through the small space. "Stay down," Mark shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the chaos. He scanned the area, trying to locate the shooter. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a figure darting toward a window at the far end of the room. Without hesitation, Mark sprang to his feet and gave chase. The figure turned out to be a man, armed and clearly intent on escaping. He fired blindly as he ran, forcing Mark to duck behind furniture and debris scattered across the room. Adrenaline surged through Mark's veins as he closed the distance between them. When the man reached the window, he hesitated for a split second, just long enough for Mark to tackle him to the ground. The struggle was fierce. The man thrashed wildly, swinging his weapon like a club. Mark blocked the blows as best he could, his training kicking in automatically. With a final burst of strength, he managed to disarm the assailant and pin him to the floor. Backup arrived moments later, cuffing the man and dragging him away. Breathing heavily, Mark pushed himself to his feet, scanning the room for any other threats. But where was the woman? A soft noise drew his attention to a closet tucked away in the corner. Slowly, cautiously, Mark approached it, his gun raised. "Come out with your hands up," he barked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. After a moment of silence, the closet door creaked open, revealing the woman from the surveillance footage. She stepped out slowly, her hands raised above her head. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear or perhaps something else. Mark couldn't tell. She wore all black just as she had in the video, and her expression was unreadable. "Who are you?" he demanded, keeping his weapon trained on her. "What's your connection to the syndicate?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Then in a quiet, trembling voice, she said, "I'm not who you think I am." Mark exchanged a glance with Detective Sarah Collins, who had entered the room behind him. "We'll see about that," Sarah said firmly, stepping forward to handcuff the woman. As they led her out of the apartment, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something significant. There was an aura of mystery around her, a guardedness that suggested she wasn't just a pawn in the syndicate's game. Back at the precinct, interrogations began immediately. The woman identified herself as Elena Cruz, a name that sent ripples through the investigative team. Records showed she had ties to several high-profile cases involving money laundering and human trafficking. Yet when questioned, Elena claimed she had been coerced into working for the syndicate under threat of harm to her family. "They took everything from me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "My home, my freedom. I didn't have a choice." Her story was compelling, but Mark remained skeptical. Was she telling the truth, or was this another ploy to gain sympathy? To compel the truth, forensic analysts combed through her belongings, searching for anything that might corroborate or contradict her claims. Meanwhile, detectives dug deeper into her background, uncovering connections to individuals linked to the syndicate's leadership. As days passed, Pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Phone records revealed frequent communication between Elena and known members of the organization. Financial documents showed large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts in her name. Yet, there were also signs of resistance. A series of encrypted messages hinting at plans to expose the syndicate from within. Detective Collins theorized that Elena might have been playing a dangerous double game. If she was gathering evidence against them, Sarah explained during a briefing, she could be our key to dismantling the entire operation. But proving her theory required more than speculation. It required concrete proof. In the meantime, tensions mounted both inside and outside the precinct. Anonymous threats began pouring in, warning officers to drop the case or face consequences. Someone even left a bullet on Mark's desk, a chilling reminder of the risks involved. Despite the pressure, Mark refused to back down. He knew they were close to something big, something that could finally put an end to the syndicate's reign of terror. One evening, after hours of reviewing files, Mark stumbled upon a crucial piece of information. Hidden among Elena's confiscated belongings was a USB drive containing detailed records of the syndicate's operations, names, locations, transactions, and even future plans. It was the smoking gun they had been searching for. Excitement rippled through the team as they realized the significance of the discovery. With this evidence, they could dismantle the syndicate once and for all. But Mark couldn't help but wonder, why had Elena kept such incriminating material? Was it a desperate attempt to protect herself, or part of a larger strategy to bring down those who controlled her? The answer came during a late-night conversation with Elena. Sitting across from her in the interrogation room, Mark asked point-blank, "Why did you keep this?" He slid the USB drive across the table, watching her reaction carefully. Elena hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because one day I wanted to make sure they paid for what they've done, to me, to my family, to everyone they've hurt." Her words struck a chord deep within Mark. For the first time, he saw her not as a suspect, but as a victim caught in a web of corruption and violence. Still, justice demanded accountability, and Elena's role in the syndicate couldn't be ignored. As the investigation continued, Mark found himself grappling with conflicting emotions: anger at the crimes committed, compassion for those ensnared by circumstance, and resolve to ensure that no one else suffered at the hands of these criminals. With the discovery of the USB drive, the investigation took a dramatic turn. The contents of the drive painted a damning picture of the syndicate's operations, names of key players, detailed accounts of illegal transactions, and even plans for future crimes. It was everything Officer Mark Thompson and his team needed to dismantle the organization once and for all. Yet, as they delved deeper into the evidence, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Elena Cruz's story was far from over. Elena had become both a suspect and a potential ally. Her claim of being coerced into working for the syndicate seemed plausible, but her possession of such incriminating evidence raised questions. Had she been gathering intel to expose the syndicate, or was she using it as leverage to protect herself? Detective Sarah Collins believed the former, pointing out that Elena's encrypted messages hinted at attempts to reach out to law enforcement anonymously. But Mark remained cautious. Trusting someone connected to the syndicate, even if reluctantly, was a risk he wasn't sure they could afford. The decision to involve Elena in their efforts was met with heated debate among the investigative team. Some argued that her cooperation could provide invaluable insight into the inner workings of the syndicate. Others feared she might be leading them into a trap. In the end, the choice was clear. Without her help, piecing together the full scope of the operation would take months, maybe years. With time running out and threats escalating, they decided to bring her on board, but under strict supervision. Elena agreed to cooperate, though her demeanor remained guarded. She provided details about secret meetings, drop-off points, and coded communications used by the syndicate. Her knowledge proved invaluable, allowing detectives to identify additional members and freeze millions in illicit funds. However, every revelation came with a price. Each name uncovered meant another target marked for revenge, and the syndicate wasn't known for showing mercy. As the case progressed, Mark found himself spending more time with Elena during debriefings. At first, their interactions were purely professional. He asked questions, she answered. But over time, a fragile rapport developed. One evening, after hours of reviewing documents, Mark noticed how exhausted she looked. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she sipped her coffee. "You don't have to push yourself this hard," Mark said gently, leaning back in his chair. "We're getting close. You've already done more than anyone could ask." Elena stared at him for a moment before responding. "Do you know what it's like to live your life looking over your shoulder?" she asked quietly. "To wake up every morning wondering if today is the day they'll find you?" Mark didn't respond right away. He had seen fear in people's eyes before, but there was something different about Elena's vulnerability. It wasn't just fear, it was regret, guilt, and a desperate desire to make things right. For the first time, he allowed himself to see her not as a criminal or a pawn, but as a human being caught in a nightmare not of her own making. Despite her cooperation, Elena's presence continued to stir unease within the precinct. Officers whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether relying on her was wise. Even Mark occasionally doubted their decision, especially when anonymous threats grew more frequent and specific. Someone had leaked information about Elena's involvement, putting her and everyone around her at risk. One night, as Mark prepared to leave the station, an urgent call came in. A patrol car had spotted suspicious activity near Elena's temporary safe house. Without hesitation, Mark grabbed his gear and rushed to the scene. When he arrived, the area was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. The house was dark, its windows shuttered tightly against prying eyes. Inside, chaos awaited. Furniture lay overturned, glass shards littered the floor, and blood smeared one of the walls. Mark's stomach churned as he scanned the room, searching for any sign of Elena. Then, a faint groan drew his attention to a figure slumped in the corner. It was Elena, clutching her side where a bullet wound seeped crimson through her fingers. "Stay with me," Mark shouted, rushing to her side. He pressed down on the wound to stop the bleeding while calling for paramedics. Elena's breathing was shallow, her face pale, but she managed a weak smile. Guess I made them mad," she murmured, wincing in pain. Her words ignited a fire in Mark. Whoever had done this wasn't just targeting Elena. They were sending a message. And Mark wasn't about to let them win. At the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize Elena. Meanwhile, Mark coordinated with his team to track down those responsible for the attack. Surveillance footage revealed a black van speeding away from the scene, its license plate obscured. Witnesses reported seeing masked men entering the house shortly before the shooting occurred. Every clue pointed to retaliation from the syndicate, confirming Mark's worst fears. Back at the precinct, tensions reached a boiling point. Officers demanded answers, and higher-ups pressured the team to wrap up the case quickly. But Mark knew rushing would only lead to mistakes. They needed to strike strategically, ensuring that no loose ends remained. Using the evidence from the USB drive, they identified several high-value targets, including the elusive mastermind behind the entire operation. Plans for a final raid began taking shape. This time, however, secrecy was paramount. The team operated under radio silence, communicating only through secure channels. Mark insisted on leading the operation personally, despite protests from his superiors. "This started with me," he argued. "It ends with me." On the night of the raid, the air crackled with anticipation. Armed with intelligence gathered from Elena and other sources, the SWAT team descended upon a remote compound suspected of housing the syndicate's leadership. The building loomed ominously against the night sky, surrounded by dense woods. Lights flickered faintly in the windows, casting eerie shadows across the grounds. As they breached the perimeter, gunfire erupted almost instantly. Syndicate members fought back fiercely, determined to protect their stronghold. Mark led his team through the chaos, navigating narrow hallways and dodging bullets. His focus never wavered. Every step brought them closer to justice. Finally, they reached the heart, of the compound, a heavily fortified office where the mastermind was believed to be hiding. Kicking open the door, Mark came face to face with a man seated calmly at a desk, a gun resting casually in his hand. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble," the man said, smirking. "But it stops here." Mark tightened his grip on his weapon, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Not tonight." The standoff in the dimly lit office felt like an eternity. Officer Mark Thompson stood frozen, his weapon trained on the man behind the desk, the mastermind of the syndicate that had terrorized Ridgefield for years. The room was silent except for the faint hum of electricity and the sound of heavy breathing. Mark's finger hovered over the trigger, but he hesitated. He had spent months chasing this moment, yet now that it was here, he realized how fragile the line between justice and vengeance truly was. The man at the desk smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he were untouchable. "You think you've won?" he said mockingly, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Even if you take me down tonight, there will always be someone else to pick up the pieces. You can't stop what we've built." Mark tightened his grip on his gun, his jaw clenched. "Maybe not," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "But I can make sure you don't get to see it." For a split second, their eyes locked. A battle of wills played out in silence. Then, without warning, the man lunged for the weapon on his desk. Shots rang out, shattering the stillness of the room. When the smoke cleared, the mastermind lay motionless on the floor, his smug expression replaced by emptiness. Mark lowered his weapon, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through his veins. It was over, or so he thought. As backup flooded into the compound, securing the area and rounding up remaining syndicate members, Mark took a moment to process what had just happened. He had pulled the trigger, ending a life to protect countless others. Yet instead of relief, he felt a hollow ache in his chest. Killing wasn't justice, it was closure, and even then, it came at a cost. Back at the precinct, the aftermath of the raid dominated every conversation. Dozens of arrests had been made, millions in assets seized, and the syndicate's operations crippled beyond repair. For the first time in years, Ridgefield could breathe easier. Reporters swarmed the station, eager to document the story of how a small-town cop brought down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the region. But Mark avoided the spotlight, retreating to his desk where stacks of paperwork awaited him. Elena Cruz, recovering slowly in the hospital, became a symbol of redemption for many. Her cooperation had been instrumental in dismantling the syndicate, and while she still faced charges for her involvement, prosecutors agreed to consider leniency given her role in bringing the criminals to justice. During visits, Mark noticed a change in her demeanor. Gone was the fear and desperation. In its place was a quiet determination to rebuild her life. She thanked Mark repeatedly, though he insisted she didn't need to. "You did the hard part," he told her one evening, sitting beside her bed. "I just followed your lead." Elena shook her head. "No, you gave me a chance when no one else would. That means more than you know." Her words lingered with Mark long after he left the hospital. They reminded him why he had chosen this path, to give people hope, even in their darkest moments. But they also forced him to confront the toll the case had taken on him. Sleepless nights, endless stress, and the weight of difficult decisions had left him drained. For the first time, he wondered if it was worth it. Weeks turned into months, and life in Ridgefield slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such upheaval. The streets felt safer, businesses thrived, and families no longer lived in fear. Mark continued his work, but something inside him had shifted. He found himself questioning whether he could keep doing this indefinitely. Every arrest, every raid, every tragedy weighed heavier on his shoulders than before. One evening, as he sat alone in his patrol car parked near the edge of town, Mark reflected on everything that had transpired. From the night he stopped the idea speeding Hearse to the final confrontation in the compound, each decision had led him closer to justice. But at what personal cost? He thought about Elena, whose courage had inspired him, and the countless victims of the syndicate who would never find peace, Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about healing the broken. When Detective Sarah Collins approached him the next day, Mark knew she could sense his internal struggle. "You okay?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "I don't know," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "This job, it changes you. I used to think I could fix everything, but now—" Sarah nodded knowingly. "It's okay to admit you're not invincible, Mark. What you did, it saved lives. Don't lose sight of that." Her words brought some comfort, but Mark knew deep down that he needed a change. Not because he doubted his abilities, but because he wanted to ensure he could continue serving others without losing himself in the process. After much deliberation, he decided to step back from active duty and focus on mentoring younger officers, sharing the lessons he'd learned along the way. Years later, Mark's story became legend in Ridgefield. Retired but still respected, he often spoke at community events, recounting the tale of the coffin filled with cash and the journey that followed. His message was simple. Justice required courage, perseverance, and sometimes sacrifice. But above all, it demanded humanity. During one speech, a young officer approached him afterward, asking for advice. "How do you stay strong when things get tough?" the rookie asked earnestly. Mark smiled, remembering the challenges he'd faced. "You don't always feel strong," he replied, "but you remind yourself why you started, and you trust that even in the darkest corners of the world, light can shine through." As Mark walked away, the sun setting behind him, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had fought for justice, not perfection, and though scars remained, both visible and invisible, he knew he had made a